give this to everybody. Very official, so you guys all know. All right. So are you guys ready to get started? I think since we're recording it, we're okay to go ahead and jump in.
Sure.
Yeah, perfect. So thank you everybody for being here again. Appreciate everybody's time. I know November is an important month for us with C. diff awareness, something that we want to focus on year round, but this is kind of our spotlight month to make sure we're doing everything we can to communicate the necessity for C. diff awareness. This is recorded, as I mentioned, to share with our lovely friends that couldn't be here today or who might jump in late. So first of all, introductions. Christian John Lillis is here. He is the executive director of the Peggy Lillis Foundation, our wonderful leader in these efforts. Dr. Bruce Hirsch is here as well. He's on the PLF Scientific Advisory Council, a board member. He's pioneered microbiome medicine for the treatment of gut infections, among many other wonderful things that he works on. And we're very happy to have him here today to talk about C. diff and his work with the Peggy Lillis Foundation. We also have Christina Fuhrman here. Thank you so much for being here. She is a wonderful mom from Columbia, Missouri, and she is a C. diff survivor. She also is one of the co-chairs of the Advocates Council for the Peggy Lillis Foundation and does a wonderful job helping other survivors become active as advocates and puts her life out there on the CDC blog, among other places, to showcase being a survivor of C. diff and how you can continue to work in that space. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. I'm going to hand it over to Christian now, who's going to give us kind of an overview of PLF, as well as some of the exciting things that are going on this month that we are happy to share with all of you.
Sorry, I was muted because there was a plane going overhead.
You're good.
So thanks everyone for being here, and for those of you who will watch this after the fact. So to give you just a little bit of background, we started the Peggy Lillis Foundation in the summer of 2010, following the April 2010 death of my mother, Peggy Lillis, from a community-acquired C. diff infection. At the time of her death, she was only 56 years old. She was a kindergarten teacher at a public school here in Brooklyn. And she was also a single mom for most of the time that my brother and I were growing up. My brother Liam is our official co-founder, though, our extended family and friends and loved ones are really pivotal in helping this get off the ground. So I always like to recognize them and how important they are. And so our mission currently is to build a nationwide C. diff awareness and advocacy movement. We do that by educating the public, by empowering advocates like Christina, and shaping public policy. So we work closely with doctors, policymakers, elected officials, regulators, and of course, the people most directly affected by C. diff infections, which are the survivors and the people who lose a loved one to them. Bruce will definitely get into more details about this, but we have at least 500,000 C. diff infections every year, and at least 30,000 deaths. That's more than HIV/AIDS at this point. That's more than driving under the influence. Obviously, public health issues that have received widespread attention, public investment. And so a big part of what we're looking to do is to bring C. diff to the same level as those other public health crises and have it be addressed in the same way. An ongoing challenge, not just for doctors, but also for people like Christina, is that C. diff has a very low public awareness. Only about 30% of Americans have heard of it. And I would contrast that with something like even Ebola. 86% of Americans have heard of Ebola. And in the entire history of the United States, only one person has died of Ebola on US soil. So the sort of media attention to diseases is not necessarily the attention that is not necessarily being paid to the diseases that are actually dangerous to the average American, like C. diff. So that's something else we're focused on. So for C. diff Awareness Month in November, we launched in 2019 a campaign called See C. diff. And we've had wonderful help from advocates like Christina and many others who are sharing their stories online, on social media, in video, with the press. And so this year, we are looking to reach at least 1 million people through our efforts with engaging the media, through social media, through partnerships with other nonprofits and industry groups. And so we really want people to be aware of this, because if you're not aware of the disease, you can't engage in prevention, and as Bruce will get into, like one of the number one precipitating factors of a C. diff infection is taking antibiotics. And so to the degree that we can lessen the use of unnecessary antibiotics, we can begin to decrease this infection. And the last thing I would say is that before I turn it over, is in addition to looking to reach at least 1 million people this year, and next year it will probably be 2 or 3 million. We always raise the stakes every year. We are also currently calling on the Centers for Disease Control to have C. diff designated as a nationally notifiable disease. Currently, C. diff is reported primarily through regulation from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, and mostly by hospitals and to some extent nursing homes. But with almost half of infections occurring in the community, people who are not currently in a hospital or nursing facility, a lot of people are going uncounted. And so we think that it's critically important that the CDC take this seriously. We think the CDC obviously does great work, but we feel like this is something that we need to call urgent attention to. So I'm happy to dig into that a little bit more, probably will a bit later. But for now, I'd love to turn it over to Bruce to give folks a little bit more about the disease and kind of where we are with the sort of treatment, diagnostics and stuff of C. diff at the moment. Bruce, do you want to take it away? You're muted.
I'm sorry about that. Christian, your personal story is really an inspiration, and then the privilege of working with you and with people like Christina has really been motivating. C. diff, Clostridioides difficile, is a bad bug. It's a bad germ. And this bad germ takes advantage of the body when it's exposed to antibiotics. Antibiotics are wonderful. I'm an infectious disease doctor. Every day of my professional life, I am using antibiotics. But we know that antibiotics have adverse effects, and antibiotics impact on the innocent bystanders in our lower GI tract. The good bacteria that we now know is actually very important for our health in all kinds of ways. The most dramatic way, or one of the most dramatic ways, is being able to fight off bad germs like C. diff. The C. diff bug releases a toxin, and it could cause very, very severe inflammation inside the colon. And that inflammation manifests itself as extensive diarrhea. The body pours fluid into the large intestine, and that fluid comes out as diarrhea. The diarrhea is a kind of a defense mechanism to wash out the bug, to wash out the toxin, to try to protect people from the worst impacts of C. diff. C. diff can be devastating. A person who has severe C. diff can lose their life, can lose their livelihood, can lose the quality of life. And awareness about our internal ecology is just as important as being aware about the world around us. C. diff has to come high in the awareness of doctors like myself who use antibiotics, and everyone who takes antibiotics or is tempted to take antibiotics. Years ago, you would hear the idea that I want to take an antibiotic early, just in case, to prevent any health problems. And we now know for lots of reasons that antibiotics are to be avoided and to be minimized and to be cultivated as the life-saving tool they are when appropriate in the right circumstance. Being aware of C. diff leads to earlier diagnosis. Earlier diagnosis leads to earlier treatment. We're now learning more about how to treat C. diff, how to use some of the newer medications. Newer trials right now are utilizing different types of good germs, a kind of bacteriotherapy, and pharmaceutical companies are now generating and exploring different options for us so that we're able to treat C. diff more effectively. C. diff is too common. Anybody who takes an antibiotic is vulnerable to C. diff, and being aware of this complication, just like being aware of other health issues, is really, really crucial. So what does it mean to have C. diff? Each person is a little bit different, but we're honored to have Christina Fuhrman with us, who has lived C. diff and has turned that experience into advocacy, education for other people, and has been a pleasure to work with. Christina, do you want to share your story?
Love to, Bruce. Thank you so much. And I don't know about you all, but I could listen to Bruce talk all day. He has such a way about him. Thank you. I really appreciate everybody being here today. I think this is such an important message that we have. And I kind of represent the average American and the American that kind of fell into the black hole of information. I took antibiotics considering them completely harmless. I never heard of a bacteria called C. diff. I never considered that antibiotic use could even be inappropriate. And so I certainly had never heard of antibiotic resistance as well. And so in 2012, I was preparing for my wedding season and being no stranger to antibiotics when I was prescribed a preventative antibiotic for a root canal. I didn't think anything of it. And so I took it like I had taken so many before. I think it's important to note that I did not have an infection. This was preventative. Within a couple of weeks, I became very ill, a fatigue I had never known before. I couldn't think right. And then diarrhea started, abdominal pain, and I just could not get better. I went to doctors several times. I got fluids, and weeks passed. And I was finally hospitalized because I was so incredibly dehydrated. And it was in the hospital that I was asked a question: have you recently taken antibiotics? And I said, yes. And they tested me for C. diff, and I was positive. And the fact that an infection was this dangerous and I was that sick and I'd never heard of it before was absolutely mind blowing to me. So for 7 months, I was in and out of the hospital on round after round of antibiotics to treat this infection that just would not go away. I barely made it out of the hospital in time to attend my own wedding. And I spent my honeymoon, back in the hospital in isolation. It was horrible. It was only because of an alternate treatment called the fecal transplant that I got over C. diff, because we were looking at having my colon removed at the age of 30, and I was perfectly healthy before. So after the fecal transplant, I recovered. It was slow, but I recovered. And I thought this nightmare was over. A year after my recovery, I gave birth to a very healthy little girl named Pearl, and I did everything right. I avoided unnecessary antibiotics. I breastfed. I was just very, very careful with my little girl. And to my greatest horror, by the time she was 22 months old, she came down with a C. diff infection. I mean, these spores can live a very long time. And no matter what I did to protect her, it wasn't enough. And she also had never had antibiotics before, ever. It took a long time to get Pearl diagnosed with C. diff. She was very sick for 2 months before she was diagnosed. In fact, we went to the hospital and were about to be discharged, but by the grace of God, she spiked a fever and had to be admitted. And it was there that she was diagnosed with C. diff. Had we waited much longer, she could have gone septic. and died. It was very bad. So I think it's so important, Peggy Lillis offers such a platform for people like me and like Dr. Hirsch to talk about these matters, because people's lives depend on it. We just don't know out there, making C. diff a nationally notifiable disease is also so important, because the more information, the more people that we know have this, the more information can be gathered. The net is spread wider, and it's just so crucial that we get this information out there. I could have died from it. My daughter could have died from it, just because we simply did not know that it existed. And the doctors also couldn't believe someone who is healthy could contract this disease. And so I'm so grateful for the Peggy Lillis Foundation and all that we're doing. And I think, we're going to do big things. And I want everyone who cares to join alongside in helping us make people more educated about this disease.
Thanks, Christina. I really appreciate you sharing your story. Before I talk a little bit more about what we're doing this month, do you want to just share a little bit about what you've done as an advocate, like the sort of how you've used the platform? Because I think that would be interesting for people to know.
Yeah. I reached out to Christian a couple of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, just wanting, to kind of get information. And I was writing my own little website to just kind of help I could. And just his passion was so contagious. I'll never forget our first conversation, because I knew he really, really cared. And that in itself is the basis for with Peggy Lillis Foundation. So I shared my story on their website. And then before I knew it, I was sharing my story everywhere. I've been in Russian TV. There's a German documentary that came over, a film crew that came over to film our story. We've been in Parents Magazine, Washington Post. I've testified in front of a presidential advisory committee, and helped my neighbors. And so, big or small, Peggy Lillis offers such great information. We've got a care guide out there. We're getting a peer support program put in place. And it's a net that reaches so many people like me, a housewife, people like Dr. Hirsch, doctors, everybody has a place with Peggy Lillis and their information. And so, I've been able to do so much through this platform that PLF has offered. And it's so exciting. And calling Christian was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life.
I'm surprised you say that, considering that I keep asking you to do stuff. But I think what Christina pointed out is something that we really work to inspire in people and to help train people to do, which is that the average person can make a difference when it comes to infectious diseases, and C. diff specifically, by sharing their story, by and Bruce got into the weeds, I guess, of C. diff, and it is an embarrassing condition for many people. Discussing bowel movements and feces is considered taboo in much of our country, and so it's a brave thing to do, to come out and share your story, but it's also something that we are working to destigmatize, because Bruce has kids, Christina has kids, I have a wonderful nephew, and many, many younger cousins. So we've all changed a lot of diapers in our lives. And so, parents don't think anything of that. And so we need to kind of, make people more comfortable talking about poop and talking about what's going on with them. I didn't go into a lot of details of my mother's story, but so just like Christina, she went to the dentist, she had a root canal, she was given clindamycin. And because in many cases it takes time, maybe a few days of being on the antibiotic for the C. diff to start present itself, we never made the connection. We'd never heard of C. diff. My mother being a kindergarten teacher, we thought, oh, she caught a stomach bug from the kids. So there's a lot of potentiality for people to dismiss their symptoms and think, oh, it's just a little bug, it's just a little food poisoning. And I think part of that is we're not talking about the details of what's going on if we're going to the bathroom 20 times a day, you know? So one of the things that we've done with our awareness campaign, and Christina has been a part of that along with many other of our we have about 25 people currently who are part of the Advocates Council, is sharing their story and helping to sort of let people know that they know people who have had C. diff. You know, our experience after my mother died is we found out that 3 people just in our little neighborhood in Brooklyn had, in the sort of preceding and 6 months or a year before my mother's death, had C. diff and died from it. But no one was talking about it because of the symptoms, because 2 of the people were elderly. And so they weren't quite as outraged by it as they were the death of a relatively young woman. So we have, as part of our C diff campaign, a sub-campaign called You Know C. diff, where people like Christina say, like, you know, I'm a mom, I'm a homemaker, and I'm a C. diff survivor. And we're trying to get people to connect that it could be anybody, you know. So we also earlier this month on November 1st, to kick off C. diff awareness month, we held our 2021 gala. I was trying to think of which annual it was. I think it was the 11th annual gala. We did it virtually in keeping with COVID, and we do hope very much to be back in person next year. But we had 3 amazing honorees, including Christina getting the Advocates Award. But we also recognized a professor of pharmacy, Debbie Goff, who's a member of our Scientific Advisory Council, and Dr. Vivian Liu from McGill University, who is an expert and researcher in diagnostics. Excuse me. And all told, the gala this year raised $58,000. In the past, we've raised as much as $100,000, but it also costs a lot more to do it in person. So, and one of the goals this year with our gala and last year was to actually, by doing it virtually, was to let anybody attend. We didn't charge anybody to attend, and therefore we reached a lot more people. Typically in person, we have like 250 people. As of right now, over 1,200 people have watched the gala on YouTube and Facebook. So we just want to make sure that people can get the information. We've also raised an additional $27,000 since the start of November. So we're only 11 days in. So we're hoping to raise a lot more this month. And the funds that we're raising are in support of the C. diff campaign. And as I mentioned earlier, this is our 3rd year of the campaign. The first year we reached just 80,000 people. Last year we reached 280,000 people, and this year we're aiming for 1 million people. And so the funds that are being raised are supporting outreach to the media. They're supporting the development of our new PSA, which we're going to share with you momentarily. They're supporting paid advertising on social media and YouTube, because you just can't reach people unless you have a little bit of money to spend these days. And the results so far have been incredibly encouraging. In just the first week of this campaign, we had already reached over 150,000 people just on social media. And we've had some articles come out. We've had some additional interviews that are coming out, some podcasts that will be on coming very shortly. So we're definitely, you know, hitting the gas and trying to reach as many people as possible. So with that said, Michelle, do we want to share the PSA now, and then people can have a look at it for themselves?
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to play the PSA now. I'm going to share my screen so that you guys can check that out. All right.
There's no sound.
You can't hear the sound?
No, I can't. Can you guys?
1 second. Let me see.
Please stand by. We're experiencing some
Stand
technical.
by.
While we're waiting, I just want to say that C. diff has evolved. When I was in training, when I was in medical school, it was considered just a nuisance bacteria, very occasionally causing severe problems in the oldest and the most frail of individuals. But C. diff has evolved and changed. And in the early 2000s, we started seeing a hypervirulent strain. The BI-NAP1 strain was described previously. And now C. diff is really impacting everyone. And I think that's part of the point that will be made on this PSA. We're no longer seeing it just in the frail elderly, we can see it in anyone. And although we've been somewhat successful at decreasing C. diff in hospitals and healthcare facilities, community-acquired C. diff for people who are not in the hospital, not in the nursing home, is continuing to go up. And so this is something that's very important to be aware of.
I'm going to try this one more time.
Our mother loved children, but never got to meet her grandson.
C. diff took her at the age of 56 in just 6 days.
After Mom died, we learned that C. diff infections kill almost 30,000 Americans each year. You can make a difference.
Join our campaign to raise C. diff awareness.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much again for everyone being here. Christian, I don't know if you have any last remarks before we open it up to questions, but just wanted to throw it back your way.
Excuse me. Yeah, I just want to say that to the extent that folks in the media are willing to share the PSA and write about it, that would be an enormous help to us, but an enormous service to the public, because knowing the risk factors for C. diff, you know, my brother and I, sort of shortly after Mom passed away, we kind of decided that we wouldn't engage in a lot of what ifs. Like, what if we would have told her to go to the hospital sooner? Or what if she wasn't such a stubborn Irish Catholic woman? You know, what if she didn't downplay her symptoms to us? But the reality of it is that with something like sepsis, with any infection, and we've seen this so much over the past 2 years with COVID, that, you know, getting treated quickly, you know, knowing what bacteria or virus you have and getting the appropriate, whether that's an antibiotic, an antifungal, an antiviral, or just supportive care if you're elderly or immunocompromised, is really critical to make sure that people survive these infections. I would say that I think pre-COVID, a lot of Americans thought that we had conquered infectious diseases. You know, we had HIV, we had hepatitis, but for the most part, the average American thought of themselves as immune to the kind of infectious disease deaths that we used to see before we had antibiotics. But two things. Despite having antibiotics, even pre-COVID, we were losing several 100,000 Americans to a variety of infectious diseases every year, many of them preventable. And that's everything from flu to pneumonia to HIV, of course. And also, part of why, in addition to preventing C. diff, we want to preserve antibiotics is because we have increasing issues with antibiotic resistance. And there's a lot of talk among public health leaders and scientists and doctors like Bruce about a post-antibiotic future where we won't have enough new drugs to deal with these rapidly evolving organisms. And so it's critically important that we do get the public engaged in this, and that the public understands that this is as big a threat to us as any, you know, as climate change, as war, as poverty. Like it is right up there with something that in the near term I mean, it's already costing people their lives, but in in a not too distant future, it could be something that is costing millions of lives every year. So so we encourage people to share this, to promote it. We're going to do our best. And of course, we're happy to take any questions people have.
I was going to throw out a question too, in that, we obviously awareness, like sharing the PSA, sharing the website, different things like that can help in the fight against C. diff and helping people become more aware. What are some other ways, that people can become involved, protect themselves? How can, someone be a personal advocate for themselves or their family against something like C. diff? That's a question for anybody.
Bruce, you want to go?
I'd like to start. I think it's important to own your power. I find that an informed patient, a person who's curious, who wants to know, who is learning about their condition, that's an actual health partner. We want doctors to be educated. We want patients and families to be educated. We want to work together to be aware of what are the adverse effects to look out for, what are the danger signals of any type of therapy, what are the advantages and disadvantages of different types of treatments. I think looking into your care and being an active participant in your care. When I'm a doctor and I see a patient and the patient said, doc, I took some antibiotic, I don't know what it was for, I don't really remember the name. It puts me at a disadvantage. I want people to take names, write down what they have, write down what they get, write down what happens to them, and so that we can really work together and take charge of one's care.
Christina, do you want to add anything?
I think that just being really antibiotic aware and with people, did you know that if you take antibiotics, that can disrupt your gut microbiome, which can lead to a C. diff infection, which kills 30,000 people a year and infects half. Keeping those conversations going, and as far as yourself, just be careful. Get a doctor that you really trust. So that when you're sick, you work together on what is appropriate and what isn't. It's not just here's a script, have a good day. Work together. And also, we're such a clean society. We disinfect everything, keeping in mind as well that, soap and water gets rid of C. diff on your hands. The disinfectant does not. And so I think it's just, just being aware of what we're dealing with here.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would add to that there are just some basics, particularly if you feel ill or if a loved one feels ill, which is, bring somebody with you to your doctor's appointments. We think about that a lot around chronic diseases or something like cancer, but even if you just feel terrible, like having somebody go with you, don't be ashamed or feel like you're putting something on somebody. Like I'm somebody who I will go, assuming I'm not busy, but like, I will go with anybody to the doctor if they feel like they want somebody who can not be so emotional, right? If you think something's really wrong with you, it's a really hard place to be and to listen and to be the kind of active partner that Bruce is talking about. A few years ago, I had a friend who was dealing with a mass on her ovary, and she was single. I went with her to her doctor's appointments, and oftentimes after the doctor's appointment, we would go back and we would talk, and she would say, "Oh, I didn't hear him say that. I didn't realize that." If you're given information from a doctor, read everything. Like don't stop short. But also I think something that we have to be also careful of is like, make sure that the sources you're reading are credible sources. there's been a lot of disinformation around COVID and around some other diseases. And like, it's scary. You know, we live in a social media age. And so if you see something that scares you or worries you, you know, you want to track down the information to a reliable source and not rely on a blogger or somebody who has a lot of Twitter followers. Like, you want to make sure that, you know, is this CDC? Is this Johns Hopkins? And I think, you know, what Bruce said, and, you know, I do want to recognize that not everybody in America has access to quality healthcare. And in some ways, the three of us who are speaking to are lucky and privileged to have that. But my husband and I have had the same doctor for 15 years. He's our family doctor. And so when COVID happened, like, we talked to him. When the vaccines were coming out, we talked to him. You know, we had somebody who had been our partner in our health for 15 years. And so if he tells me, I think you should have this vaccine, I listen to him. I trust him to have my best interests at heart. And so that's important, is to sort of have a healthcare partner to the extent you can. And, you know, I would say, do your research, show up with questions, written questions, don't rely on your memory. And, you know, respectfully, but forcefully, if necessary, don't leave until those questions have been answered. That's something. I had to have a colonoscopy a couple of years ago, and there had just been an outbreak of there being of scopes that were not properly cleaned, and they were giving people a terrible infection called CRE, and some people died from it. And so when I had to have my colonoscopy, I called my GI doctor. I called the place that does the colonoscopy. I asked how they clean them. And, you know, to me, it's also that the public plays a role in holding the healthcare system accountable. So the more of us who ask these questions, the more responsive the healthcare system will be to us. You know, previous generations felt like, oh, the doctor knows best, and I don't want to be a burden, and I don't want to bother. That's what my grandmother would say. But medicine is so complex, and we're learning new things every day, that we need people who are going to be willing to sort of ask the tough questions.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's important to be your own advocate, or bring someone with you who's able to advocate for you, and take those notes and remember those things. So those are great action items for anyone who's wondering how to help themselves in that kind of scenario. Just going to pause in case anyone has any questions while we wait for anyone to speak up, or you can put in the chat. I also want to say, you know, a great place to find more information on C. diff is obviously the Peggy Lillis Foundation website. You can also find them on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at Peggy Fund. If you want to go on and follow for more information, Dr. Hirsch and Christina's stories and information are also on the website if you want to check out their bios or information. And, you know, thanks again for everyone being here today and supporting us too. Back to Christian.
Yeah, one last note is that the C. diff campaign has a dedicated website at cdiff.org. So that's worth checking out as well.
Perfect. Yeah. And we will also, the PSA is available to check out on social media and websites as well. And I can send that a link to anyone that's interested too. All right, guys, I think we're good to wrap up. Anyone have any last remarks or anything they wanted to share?
No, I want to thank Christina and Bruce for taking time to do this with us. Thank you, Michelle, for setting it up. And thanks to everybody who is here and everyone who writes about it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Everybody have a good one.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.